It was one of the deadliest days in American history. The city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania was already flooded with 12 feet of rainwater when the South Fork Dam, 14 miles up the valley, collapsed, unleashing a wall of water up to 75 feet high and traveling at nearly 40 miles per hour. Nothing that stood in its way had a chance. Buildings were ripped from their foundations. Entire trains full of passengers were thrown like toys, and the city of Johnstown and its surrounding boroughs, home to 30,000 people, were obliterated. What caused the dam's collapse? Was it greed and negligence, or was this terrible tragedy inevitable from the start? In this adventure, we're traveling to Johnstown in Cambria County, Pennsylvania to see what little remains of the pre-flood city and see the lasting impact that this disaster had on the town. And then visiting the Johnstown Flood Museum to look at the artifacts that witnessed that terrible day in May 1889. Finally, we're making our way to the dam itself, following the flood down the entirety of the valley, recreated with detailed animations in Unreal Engine 5 to see the disaster like never before. Flood, fire, and destruction. This is the Great Johnstown Flood on Part-Time Explorer. Looking at Johnstown today, it seems like any other Pennsylvania city, with classical brick downtown buildings, open public parks, city buses, and parking garages. It isn't until you walk the streets and take in your surroundings that you start to see just how alive its history still is, with historical groups such as the Johnstown Area Heritage Association and other local community organizations dedicating memorials and erecting historical markers all throughout the city to keep the memory of the Great Flood of 1889 from fading away, even after 130 years. Only a dozen or so buildings that survived the flood still stand today in downtown Johnstown, but we'll be seeing nearly all of them in this video. Many of the old-looking buildings, however, were built right after the flood in the nationwide efforts to rebuild the obliterated town. One of these buildings is the old Cambria County Library, built on the site of the original 1879 library that was destroyed by the flood. This building today is home to the Johnstown Flood Museum, operated by the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. The museum is home to several artifacts recovered from the disaster, some of which we'll be taking a closer look at. But right in the center of the museum, facing you as you first walk in, is a gorgeous diorama showing the path from the dam that burst all the way through the valley and into Johnstown. Just looking at this model, we can see how even the geography and terrain were working against the city. The town itself sits between two rivers in a deep valley, with hills nearly half a mile high in every direction.
Everywhere we look around Johnstown, the city is surrounded by hills. Any large body of water coming through here is going to be funneled, and Johnstown is going to be right in its direct path. The city wouldn't stand a chance.
The downtown itself was built on a fairly flat plain of land, with only minor degrees in elevation, making it a nightmare for water runoff.
With the two rivers, hills in every direction, and the flatness of Johnstown, the city was considered to be a severe flood zone in the heart of what is called the Conemaugh Valley.
The Conemaugh Valley follows the Little Conemaugh River from its source high in the hills through a winding gorge for several miles until it links up with the Stony Creek River. There, the Little Conemaugh River and Stony Creek River join to become the Big Conemaugh River, also known simply as the Conemaugh River. In 1769, a Philadelphian named Charles Campbell filed an application for the land at the confluence of the two rivers, totaling 249 acres. The land changed hands a few times without any development, until it was eventually sold to a man named Joseph Schantz from Switzerland. Schantz plotted the town out and filed for an official town charter in November 1800, naming the town Conemaugh. Even though that's the legal name, it was more commonly referred to by the locals as Schantztown. Schantz ended up selling off most of the plots in town and cashing out of the venture, moving to Bedford, Pennsylvania in 1807, passing away in 1810.
Johns is buried in that cemetery.
The town of Conemaugh began to prosper. With the soil fertile and hills rich in minerals, the future of the town was all but guaranteed. In 1806, the first iron forge was established, sourcing materials and coal locally, and more forges began to spring up. The town was officially incorporated in 1830, keeping the name of Conemaugh, but the traditional name stuck, and in 1834 legislature renamed the town to Johnstown, the anglicized version of Schantztown. Homes, businesses, schools, and all sorts of other domestic buildings were popping up, with a public commons right at the point where the two rivers meet, and a 1-acre burial plot at the southern end of town. Churches also began to grow up, from wooden-framed structures to large stone monuments. The oldest existing church in town, and the only one surviving today to predate the flood, is the First Methodist Episcopal Church on Franklin Street, today known simply as the Franklin Street Church. This was built in 1869 and was one of the largest churches in Johnstown. Indeed, Johnstown was shaping up to be everything that a successful Pennsylvania town at the time ought to be. Pennsylvania is known as the Keystone State. In the early 1800s, it was not only geographically central to the United States, but also in terms of commerce and industry, providing the industrial backbone that the growing country needed. It was industrializing faster than any other state in the Union, and its developing infrastructure reflected that. Even smaller rural communities across the state's central mountain region were being linked to the outside networks growing in from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The coal deposits throughout the region added to the state's growth, and the War of 1812 put Pittsburgh on the map as one of the country's leading iron producers. To transport the raw materials needed and the goods that were produced, as well as the growing population, a system of canals and railroads were built across the state. One system, known as the Main Line, was proposed to link Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, and not only would it come through the town now known as Johnstown, but Johnstown would be a main transfer hub for cargo being offloaded from the Allegheny Portage Railroad to the east and loaded onto the western division of the Canal to the west, which carried all the way from Johnstown to the terminus in Pittsburgh. With the canal being opened in 1834, the traffic through Johnstown boomed, and the fact that it was a transfer hub brought in more workers and ensured the town's growth. One of the biggest issues that the newly developed canal system faced was an inconsistent supply of water. In the winter and spring during the rainy seasons, water was plentiful, but in the summertime, Pennsylvania was often in a drought, and the canals ran dry. It was proposed to build a large earthen dam just above the eastern terminus of the Western Division Canal, so somewhere above Johnstown. This would allow them to store up water in the rainy months and use them during the dry months. The project was approved in 1836, and two engineers, Sylvester Welsh and William Morris, were tasked with selecting the site and designing the dam. They chose a spot 14 miles above Johnstown, up the Little Conemaugh River near the small settlement of South Fork. It became known as the South Fork Dam and was designed to contain over 3.5 billion gallons of water, or over 13.5 billion liters. 20 million tons of water would be held back, so it needed to be a large, strong dam. The dam was paid for by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and all the land above the dam site, land that was to be flooded, needed to be purchased and cleared out. While the area wasn't heavily developed, it did have a few structures and homesteads on it and nearly 400 acres of wooded forests, all of which needed to be cleared out. Work officially began in 1840. The remnants of the dam today allow us to look at the dam in a cross-section fashion, letting us visualize the construction of the earthwork inside. To the right of the frame is downstream, which would remain exposed to the outside. To the left is the watertight surface that would soon be facing the eventual lake. First, a mud and clay mound was built, layer by layer, and pounded into place, creating the full height of the dam. To protect this mound of clay from the water, a layer of small stones, known as riprap, were laid on the interior slope of the dam. Adding further strength against the mound from the outside, a layer of heavy rocks, such as slate, smashed up and piled against the mud core. On top of that, a layer of other large rocks sealed everything up. To control the buildup of water at the bottom of the dam, along the pre-existing river channel, a large stone culvert was built, which housed 5 large cast iron drainage sluice pipes. They could be opened and closed via controls inside of a wooden control tower that stood as a platform above the submerged foot of the dam. Not only do some of the stones from the culvert remain today, but the base of this wooden structure, now over 180 years old, and having been submerged underwater for around 40 of those years, can still be found where it was initially built. From this control tower, the pipes could be opened and excess water can be safely discharged. As with all earthen dams, it's absolutely imperative that water does not crest over the top of it. As long as the water is contained within the dam, it's stagnant and relatively harmless. However, once it crests over the top, water would begin picking up speed, eroding away at the top until it works its way down, cutting through any stone framework inside. At that point, collapse would be nearly unstoppable. As an emergency backup, a spillway was built on the east end of the dam. Should the water level get too close to the top of the dam, water would automatically flow out through this canal, around the dam, and safely down the river. The spillway was cut out into solid bedrock to prevent any erosion here. This is the spillway today.
The spillway itself was carved out in the solid rock because the engineers knew that that way it wouldn't erode over the years, and therefore the spillway would be relatively constant. You could see that solid rock it's carved out in.
Construction continued from 1840 until 1842, when it stalled for almost a decade due to a lack of funds. In the meantime, those iron pipes were opened and water flowed freely beneath the dam, with no buildup of water behind the structure so far. Construction finally resumed in 1851, and by 1852 some of the valves were closed and the dam began to contain water, but not to its full capacity. Some leaks were found, but this was normal and fixed. For the final year of construction, the dam essentially needed to be babysat, with repairs being conducted as further water pressure was added. Finally, in 1854, the dam was completed. Now, as of 1854, the mainline canal would never have to worry about water supply for its western division again. And now in 1854, that didn't matter. That very same year, the canal system was rendered obsolete by the expansion of the Pennsylvania Railroad, now connecting Johnstown to the rest of the main line. The state ultimately sold the canal system and South Fork Dam and Reservoir off to the Pennsylvania Railroad, who replaced most of the canal system with railroad tracks, though they had no use for the massive dam or the water that it contained, and the dam would sit in neglect for some time. The canals were eventually removed, with nearly all traces of it gone today. A mural found in downtown Johnstown pays tribute to the town's early canal routes, but one small hint of that canal can still be found today. This road follows the curvature of the old canal basin and is today known as Railroad Street after the railroad track that ran along it. Because it was along the canal basin, It indicates that these plots of land were once waterfront properties on the main line canal. With the railroad came further industrial growth. Johnstown became the nation's leading producer of iron with the founding of the Cambria Iron Company in 1852. The Cambria Iron Company sat at the north end of Johnstown along the Little Conemaugh River around the foot of Prospect Hill. A larger, more modern mill stands in the same plot of land as the Cambria Iron Company once did, a reminder of how the old ironworks once dominated over the city, and a hint as to how it looked. The success of the ironworks was largely due to the management of a businessman and Republican congressman named Daniel Morrell, who grew up in the industry and understood both the needs of the business and the concerns of the laborers, and had both groups' interests in mind. The company started slowly, but grew rapidly with the help of Daniel Morrell, ultimately pulling Johnstown's citizens out of an unemployment slump that plagued the town for 2 decades. Workers tended to really like their jobs here, appreciating all that the company was doing for them, and enjoyed fair treatment. The average pay was $1.50 a day, which was fairly good compared to the rest of the country at the time. At the end of the week, when the workers picked up their paycheck at the company offices on Locust Street, it wasn't uncommon for the workers to wear their best clothes as a sign of respect. The Cambria Iron Company made all sorts of iron products for the growing country. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, they were a leading producer of heavy equipment, such as cannons, for the Union Army. When steel was developed, they were quick to adopt the technology and manufactured steel rails for various railroads. It's been said that the advent of barbed wire is what finally tamed the Wild West, ending the need for cowboys to tend cattle on ranches, and so much of the nation's barbed wire was produced by the Cambria Iron Works, specifically the Gautier Works. So much so that one could say that Johnstown, way out here in the east, played its part in taming the West. Johnstown was indeed now a company town. The Cambria Iron Company owned much of the land around it and many of the homes that the workers lived in. The typical worker's home in Johnstown was a small wooden-framed home where they and their family lived. The company owned several stores and businesses throughout the area and even ran some of the civil services. For example, in 1866, the Iron Company established the town's hospital. In 1879, the company opened the town's library. By the 1880s, the Cambria Iron Company was one of the largest companies in Pennsylvania, and they were heavily invested in the livelihood and welfare of their home community. But it wasn't only Johnstown that was benefiting. The Iron Company had mills and facilities in many of the surrounding communities, with the majority of the populations in nearby Woodvale, East Conemaugh, and Cambria being connected to the ironworks in some way. Life in Johnstown was prosperous. The city and its surrounding boroughs were comfortable for many of the people who lived there. It was civilized. Unlike many company towns where much of the population were male laborers, Johnstown had hundreds of families with multiple schools and dozens of churches. It had several bands, social clubs, saloons, hotels, a brewery just outside of town, and even 2 downtown opera houses. Just by the Main Street Opera House was the office of one of the city's main newspapers, the Tribune. The office of the Tribune, though heavily modified, still stands today, one of the few buildings to survive the terrifying disaster that would soon strike the city. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Johnstown was a mustering point for the 54th Pennsylvania Volunteers, who were under the command of Johnstown's own Colonel Jacob Campbell. The town, like all cities across the United States, lost many young men, even though the fighting itself never reached the city.
After the war in 1866, Johnstown experienced what has been called its first real tragedy. And it involved some pretty high-profile figures at the time, including Andrew Johnson, then President of the United States.
Johnson and several of his associates, including high-up commanders for the Union during the Civil War, were taking a circuit tour of the northern states in a campaign to sway the votes for the upcoming congressional election. The presidential train pulled into the Johnstown station, right by the Cambria Ironworks, and crowds of several thousand people swarmed to get a glimpse of these figures. On the rear platform of the train, General Ulysses S. Grant emerged in full uniform to wave to the crowd. After him came Admiral David Farragut. The train stayed at the platform, but the crowd swarmed in. An iron railway bridge that spanned across the track between platforms was allegedly packed with over 2,000 people, and it gave way, collapsing onto the track, just missing the train itself. The death toll was 6, with 3 passing away outright and 3 passing in the following days. At least 200 more were injured. General Grant described the scene as sadder than a battlefield, and General George Armstrong Custer, who was also present and would later infamously be defeated at the Battle of Little Bighorn, unashamedly wept. Despite the tragedy, the town continued to grow. The population of Johnstown in the late 1880s was around 10,000 people. The whole area, including the outlying boroughs that would be a part of this story, was nearly 30,000. Despite Johnstown being a highly civilized and thoroughly domestic city, there was one lingering fear that concerned some of the citizens. That was the old South Fork Dam, built for the now defunct Canal system. The Pennsylvania Railroad held onto it for nearly 20 years without knowing what to do with it, until they eventually sold it off to one of the railroad's managers, John Riley, who, like Daniel Morrell, manager of the Cambria Iron Company, was also a Pennsylvania congressman. John, though, belonged to the Democratic Party. In 1862, while still owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, the dam partially collapsed, but the water wasn't at its full capacity, and the ensuing flood did little damage. That same year, the wooden control tower, now exposed after the reservoir emptied, burned down and was never rebuilt. Now, when John bought the dam and reservoir, it was still in ruin and not containing any water. John's goal was to hang on to the land for some time and ultimately flip it for profit, doing minor repair work and partial reconstruction on the dam as quickly as possible. For one reason or another, he decided to remove the cast iron piping from the bottom of the dam and sold it for scrap value. Now, the water flow of the dam relied solely on the spillway on the east end. With the pipes removed and the reservoir filled back up, and with the shoddy reconstruction done by John Riley and his team, the South Fork Dam was a disaster waiting to happen. In 1879, John Riley found a buyer for the property, and he sold it to him at a loss. The new owner was Benjamin Ruff from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he had grand visions for the man-made lake. The post-Civil War Industrial Revolution in the United States filled the air with soot, smog, and all sorts of nasty contaminants that made city life an unpleasant place to breathe. As most people do need to breathe, country retreats were becoming popular with fresh, clean air and outdoor recreation. That's the vision that Benjamin Ruff had, and that's what he implemented. Ruff established the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club of Pittsburgh, and with this club, he hoped to attract the wealthy elites from Pittsburgh and nearby Allegheny City. Here at the Western Reservoir, members of the club could hunt in the sprawling woodlands, go boating on the beautiful Placid Lake, or fish along its shores. Members would buy a share for $100, or today, about $3,200, with annual dues of $25, or today about $800. To put that into perspective, the average income of the day was about $1.50, or $50 today. From the club's inception, work began to develop the area into a resort. On the southwest shore of the lake, a large clubhouse and several cottages were built to accommodate members and their guests whenever they visited. The clubhouse went up first, with construction being done in 2 phases between 1880 and 1885. The clubhouse acted as a hotel for members and boasted 47 comfortable bedrooms, a grand dining room, sprawling kitchen facilities, and several boathouses in the front. A large portion of the clubhouse today still stands and is in the process of being restored. Alongside the clubhouse, branching out in both directions, was a row of 16 large summer homes that the club members quaintly referred to as cottages. Many of these cottages still stand today as well, although not all. A walking tour of the cottages is like taking a walking tour of the club's membership roster. The first cottage was owned by Walter McClintock, partner in a large mercantile business. It's believed that it was built in 1872, predating the club by 7 years. The two cottages on lots 2, 3, and 4 no longer exist. Cottage 4 belonged to David Rankin, a highly esteemed doctor from Shippensburg. This large cottage was known as the Double Cottage and was owned by 4 different club members. It was built in 1887. Walking along the row of cottages after the Double Cottage, we would come to the clubhouse, which we've already explored. Next comes the 6th cottage, this one owned by C.C. Hussey of Hussey, Howe and Company, a steelmaking firm in Pittsburgh. Cottage 7 belonged to J.J. Lawrence, partner in a paint manufacturing company in Pittsburgh and the vice president of the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club. Cottages 8 and 9 were destroyed over the years, although Cottage 8 belonged to J.J. Lawrence's business partner in his paint firm, Moses Sidum. A Methodist church now stands in their place. The 10th cottage belonged to the Clark family, who were some of the first members of the club, and also a big deal in Pittsburgh. This cluster of cottages leading out from the clubhouse had a nice boardwalk strolling right in front of them.
There was a little bridge here, and then boat houses. Right now, we'd be standing in the water. You can see how the elevation continues to go up a little bit towards the houses. We would be right about on the shoreline. Right about here was a bridge.
Now we come to this final cluster of cottages on the south end of the row, which began to move uphill away from the shore. Cottage 11 is gone today, but Cottage 12 belonged to James Brown, who worked with several steel mills in Pittsburgh. It was built in 1888, one of the last cottages built here. Cottage 13 was owned by Jesse Lippincott, a man with interest in the glass, telephone, and phonograph industries, and had this large cottage, if you can call it a cottage, built in 1885. His cottage today is currently being restored. The 14th cottage is the last one on the row that still stands today. Having been also built in 1885, this one was owned by Philander Knox, who served as U.S. Senator, Attorney General under Presidents McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, and U.S. Secretary of State under President Taft. The 15th cottage was owned by Maxwell Moorhead, who owned a steel and iron business in Pittsburgh. This area was well familiar to him. His father's company helped with the initial construction of the South Fork Dam, and Maxwell was often on site working on the project. This cottage, along with a 16th cottage that belonged to an explosives merchant, are now gone. Other members of the club included tycoons and businessmen of western Pennsylvania, including Andrew Carnegie, Henry Frick, and Andrew Mellon. To maximize the size of the lake and quality of the sport fishing done on its shores, the South Fork Club had the water level of the reservoir raised to the highest possible level, a depth of around 60 feet of water. They performed various repairs to the dam to make this possible, but these repairs were criticized by engineers as being insufficient. One of the critics of the dam was Congressman Daniel Morrell, general manager of the Cambria Iron Company, whom we met earlier. He voiced the concerns of many in Johnstown that, with the drain pipes at the bottom of the dam gone and the repairs to the structure having been done so cheaply, he felt that the dam posed a significant threat to any settlements downriver from it. He was so concerned over the dam that he joined the South Fork Club to raise these concerns at every board meeting. He even offered to oversee the necessary repairs to the dam and have them done partly at his own expense. But no, It didn't happen, and every one of his offers were refused. Daniel Morrell died in 1885, and the club continued about its operations, wearing away at the dam's stability even further while keeping the water levels at max height. The lake had been stocked with fish, and now with the spillway flowing so steadily out of the top, the club was worried that the fish would escape out the spillway.
The bridge I'm standing on spans across the spillway, and just like back in 1889, there was a wooden bridge crossing here. And this bridge was to give access, easier access across the spillway for maintenance workers, but also club members. I just put my hand in bird poop. There were nets hung from the bridge that was here to prevent the fish in the lake from escaping downstream, because they wanted the club members to be able to fish and capture them. They didn't want them getting out and the population going down.
This slowed down the flow of the water out of the spillway and increased the risk of water flowing over the dam, which would inevitably result in a total failure of the structure.
But the club actually set up right out there on that hill a post with debris catchers to sort of add a buffer space so the water could still flow through the debris and then through the fish nets, separating where the big debris is going to get caught and where the fish are going to get stopped.
If the debris catchers failed, it wouldn't be long until the water spilled over. The higher the dam was above the water line, the more buffer they had to work with. That being said, the club wanted to modify the dam further. The top of the dam also served as a walking path and small roadway, but it wasn't very wide, only wide enough for one carriage to cross the dam at a time. The club decided that they wanted to widen the road to allow for two carriages to cross abreast of one another, and to do so, they needed to lower the height of the dam. Now the dam had even less of a buffer space above the waterline. The South Fork Dam, holding back 20 million tons of water, was now a ticking time bomb. As the stability of the dam was diminished, life in Johnstown continued as usual. The winter leading into 1889 was especially rough on Pennsylvania, with heavy snow falling in the state and still melting in the Appalachian Mountains into late spring. That continuous snowmelt runoff, combined with the fact that April and May were some of the rainiest months on record, meant that the rivers were swelling and the ground was oversaturated with water. Johnstown, being right at the confluence of the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers, is prone to flooding. The rainy season often causes the rivers to overflow from the banks and flood into the city itself. Although most floods in Johnstown result in minor damage and little to no injury, they do happen often, with at least 17 significant floods happening since the town's inception up to 1889, including one every year from 1816 to 1820. May 30th was Memorial Day, and a break in the rain meant that the residents of Johnstown could commemorate the day with parades, picnics, and ceremonies. In 1889, the United States still had plenty of Civil War veterans around, and the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization of Union veterans, seems to have led the events of the day. Downtown Johnstown has a statue dedicated to the 54th Pennsylvania Volunteers. This one is a replica of an older one that stood in its place, and no doubt was the center of some of these commemorations. A parade came through the park, and much of the city turned out for the event, but it was cut short by deteriorating weather. A heavy storm rolled into the region, dropping record amounts of rain continuously for over 24 hours. I don't say record amounts of rain without meaning it. The next day, May 31st, several large cities in the area reported significant flooding and the highest rainfall in decades. Cities from West Virginia to Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia to New York City all reported flooding, with some of them saying they were flooded as deep as 12 feet. Johnstown reportedly had up to 10 feet of water in some of the lower areas, with multiple rumors of drownings across the city. Central Park, where only one day prior the Memorial Day commemorations were held, was now a lake. This photograph is noted as having been taken during the flood prior to the disaster, meaning this may be the last photograph taken in Johnstown before the South Fork Dam failed. The Pennsylvania Railroad had come to a complete stop in the area. Several trains sat idling in the rail yards between Johnstown and East Conemaugh, up the valley, including the Day Express loaded with passengers. The tracks in different parts of the valley had been washed out, and these trains would be stuck here for some time until being cleared to move forward. The post office was on the first floor of the Tribune building on Franklin Street and had closed for the day due to the weather, but the offices of the Tribune on the second floor were still actively preparing the next edition. Sure, the streets were awash, but that's big news, and that needs to be printed.
On May 31st, George Swank, the editor and publisher of the Johnstown Tribune, was on the second floor of the Tribune offices right there, which is the Grindhouse building. He was in there preparing the next edition of the Johnstown Tribune, and he looked out his window and he saw water was flooded about 1 foot deep on this street right here. Now, we're on a higher part of Johnstown. Some of the lower areas were already flooded as deep as 10 feet. But right here, up on the hill, it was about 1 foot deep. And that was around 2:30 in the afternoon.
The previous issue of the Tribune, the final one before disaster, featured an advertisement for suits which, funny enough, boasted the tagline that their competition is swept away by a wave of low prices. Stranger yet, as Swank was sitting in his office looking out on the rising rainwaters, he wrote in his paper that this would be the worst possible time for the South Fork Dam to fail, as the city was already severely crippled. Some residents in Johnstown were concerned over the still rising waters, which in some parts of the city were rising by 2 feet an hour. They gathered up their families and belongings and left town, climbing up the hills that surrounded the city. Most people, however, chose to stay in their homes and ride out the storm. At the South Fork Dam, the water was rising at a rate of about 10 inches an hour. Elias Unger was the acting president of the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club after Benjamin Ruff had passed away a few years earlier. He had his own cottage, separate from Cottage Row and the Clubhouse, on the opposite side of the lake, just by the dam itself. Most of the morning passed without any real concern at the club, but around 11 a.m., Elias started to worry that the rain wouldn't stop. The water was now within 4 feet of cresting the dam. The spillway was already blasting water out at full force, and it did little to keep the water level in check. Elias grabbed a team of workers whom he had previously engaged to install a sewer system and brought them to the western side of the dam to dig out an emergency spillway. As he and the men work, some of the club members protested, saying that their work is going to ruin the lake and put the club out of business. Well, Elias responded by saying that the club is already out of business, but it's going to happen a whole lot faster if that dam gives way. The rain continued to pour down. The saturated ground could not absorb the runoff, and the western reservoir continued to swell. Some locals, and no doubt some of the club members on hand, frantically pitched in to help Unger and his team in preserving the structure. The dam itself actually dipped down by 1 foot or 2 in the middle of the span, a result of Congressman John Riley's removal of the sluice and drainage pipes at the center of the dam, and if the water crested that point, it would only be a matter of minutes before the dam would almost completely erode away. Some of the men got to work on adding more dirt to the dam's lowest part of the crest, but this likely had very little effect in the little time that they had. Even in this frantic time, the club didn't want to risk losing the fish that they had stocked into the lake, and they chose not to remove the fish net spanning the main spillway. Well, now fallen trees became caught in those fish nets, passing the debris catcher, and slowed the outflow of water even more. The level of the lake began to rise faster.
Let's see if we can explore down into this spillway. So supports like this one would have interfered with the flow of water, even just a little bit.
Around 11:30 that morning, John Park, the club's engineer, quickly rushed down the road from the dam to the nearby town of South Fork, passing the compromised spillway along the way, and made it into town on horseback.
Right there is where the trail turns onto the old carriage road that crossed the dam. But you can see the faint impression still left of another road that went from the dam into the town of South Fork that way. This would have been the road that message was carried down to the telegraph office in South Fork to warn them and to forward a warning all the way into Johnstown. That path would have wound down there. And now we're looking down on it.
The river had already flowed over its banks in the town of South Fork, about 2 miles below the dam, and Park rushed in the direction of the rail yard, where he knew the telegraph operator would be able to forward a warning about the dam down the valley and into Johnstown. He found a crowd of people there, and he was still up on horseback, and he shouted to them that the dam is in a dangerous state and at risk of overflowing. He shouted for them to take that message to the telegraph operator so they could send the warning downstream, before he quickly turned his horse around and rushed back to the dam to help more. The crowd eventually did take the message to the telegraph office, where telegraphist Emma Ehrenfield was on duty. The man to step forward from the crowd sort of pushed his way through and made himself front and center, and he was the one to deliver the message to Emma. Unfortunately, he was known around town as being unreliable and a bit overdramatic, so Emma wasn't sure if this message was to be believed. Still, she got on the telegraph and sent the message down the valley. Just as the rail lines had been washed away, so too were some of the telegraph lines that followed the tracks. The message could only go as far as Mineral Point, 4 miles downriver. Emma discussed through the telegraph with the operator in Mineral Point if these warnings should be taken seriously. Now, in her defense, it seemed every time it rained, at least a couple times a year, warnings were sent that the dam was gonna burst. They decided, yes, they would forward these messages, but they were still skeptical. It was on this exact telegraph that Emma Ehrenfield transmitted the warnings downstream about the South Fork Dam. Since the lines were down below Mineral Point, a runner was sent from the Mineral Point telegraph office with the message written down on paper to a tower above East Conemaugh, who telegraphed the warning to Johnstown and Pittsburgh. In Johnstown, the warning made its way to the Western Union offices on Washington Street, located right next to the library where the Johnstown Flood Museum now stands. This was the home and office of Hetty Ogle, who ran the Western Union Telegraph switchboard. Hetty and her team had also been measuring the height of the river and the progress as it was rising and reporting it via telegraph to Pittsburgh, but eventually the water became so deep that her gauges became useless, and she and her team had to move their work to the second floor. Hetty received the warning about the dam, but at this point had no way of dispersing that warning around the town. In the hour and a half that it took for the warning to be sent from the dam and arrive in Johnstown, the emergency spillway that Elias Unger's team had been digging was finally completed, but it was too little, too late. A little after 12 noon, with the rain pouring down in torrents, the water crested over the top of the lowest point of the dam, the center. Now, there was no stopping it. Water swept over the top of the dam, and the river began to swell more, making its way down the valley. A second telegraph warning was dispatched and followed the same route, warning that the water had run over the dam and disaster was imminent. The dam actually held for a couple more hours, with the water cresting over it more and more. But even with the water flowing over the top, and the two spillways going at full blast, the water was still rising. So the dam's height was lowering because of erosion, and the water behind it was getting higher and higher. By 2:30, the dam was showing signs of collapse, and a third, final warning was sent. Elias Unger and his men, knowing that there was nothing more that could be done, dispersed. Elias returned to his house overlooking the dam, and collapsed. The house today still stands as offices for the National Park Service. Along the Little Conemaugh River, eyewitnesses described the floodwaters as being 8 feet higher than ever previously recorded, and the worst was still to come. At this point, many of the workers in the rail yard at South Fork, including Emma Ehrenfield, had abandoned their posts and moved up to higher ground. 3:10 p.m., and the dam finally gave way, the central portion collapsing outward, followed by a torrent of water. A moment later, the dam in either direction from the collapse began eroding away rapidly. Witnesses described it as simply melting. The floodwaters in South Fork rose rapidly. It was described more as a swelling than a wall of water. It tore down trees and low-lying buildings and ripped through the rail yard. Emma's telegraph tower was torn away, but fortunately she, most residents of South Fork, and most of the town itself were up on higher ground. In the rail yard were 2 specific trains whose story is nothing short of an action film. A freight train was pulling out of South Fork as another train, pulled by locomotive 1165, sat idle on a siding near the signal tower. The wave came crashing around the corner towards the town and rail yard, and the crew of 1165 tried to save their locomotive. They cut loose the 4 cars and caboose that they were hauling and tried to move. With so little steam built up, their train was sluggish, with the other freight train in their path still passing by. They pushed forward, forcing their way through the switch just as that freight train finished, and they were pushing up against it, actually physically pushing against the back of it. The wave swept away the 4 cars that they left behind, including half of their crew still in the caboose. As they pushed forward, the wave grabbed their tender and started slowly pulling it off of the track. They felt this in the locomotive. They could feel the water getting a grip of their train as they were trying to force their way up to higher ground. The locomotive was already surrounded by the wave, so the crew climbed forward, knowing that their locomotive was about to be carried away at any second, climbing down the cowcatcher and leapt onto the rear of the freight train ahead of them, narrowly escaping their locomotive as it was swept away. They survived, but the 2 brakemen in the caboose did not. South Fork, being up on a hill, was mostly spared. Still, 4 people in the town lost their lives, including the 2 brakemen, as a massive flow of water began ripping through the valley. The water rushed down the valley following the path of the river. It came to a point where the river meanders nearly back onto itself in an oxbow, with a short isthmus separating it. There, a tall 75-foot viaduct for the railroad stands. This viaduct was built in 1834 for the Allegheny Portage Railroad as part of the mainline canal system, and was now used by the Pennsylvania Railroad. At its middle was a single, large archway. As the wave slammed against the isthmus, the top of the wave crested over the hill and fell back down onto the viaduct, piling trees and debris down onto it. The bulk of the wave, however, followed the river all the way around the loop until pooling up behind the viaduct as well. The debris that the flow of water carried completely plugged up the viaduct, which now acted as a 75-foot-high dam. The lake had only begun to drain, with the terrible flood still raging all the way to the viaduct, where it was now pooling deeper and deeper. Here the water had time to really collect into one large force. Finally, with 20 million tons of water behind it, and with the floodwaters actually cresting 4 or 5 feet over the 75-foot top bridge, the viaduct gave way, and the full force of the flood was unleashed all at once with renewed energy. As the flood tore through the valley, there were reports of massive landslides falling into the river. Thousands of trees were carried off, and massive rocks added to the maelstrom, along with houses, locomotives, and portions of the large stone viaduct, all making up this large 75-foot wave of destruction. The face of the wave as it rolled forward was constantly crushing down onto itself, so anything that it hit was not absorbed or picked up, but rather crushed underneath the waves before being picked up into it. The next town in its path was Mineral Point, a small town of around 200 residents in a narrow bend of the canyon. The railroad tracks came through here, passing by the telegraph office that dispatched a runner to carry the warning messages to Johnstown. A bridge spanned Little Conemaugh River here. When the wave hit at 3:41 p.m., only a few buildings remained standing up on the top of the hill. The entire rest of the town was torn away, along with the bridge that spanned the river. This bell hung in the town's Methodist church. When the church was swept from its foundation, the building, with its bell tower still standing, were carried downriver, the bell tolling the entire way down until the structure finally collapsed in the water. This bell was later found 8 miles downstream. Fortunately for those in Mineral Point, the town was already flooded out, so most of the residents had evacuated up into the hills. Only 16 of the town's 200 residents were lost. East Conemaugh was one of the larger towns in the area and home to one of the largest rail yards. In its roundhouse were 9 locomotives, and in the rail yard outside were an additional 20. Sitting in the yard was the previously mentioned Day Express train waiting on the main line. Another passenger train sat with it. Because these trains were waiting here for hours due to the washed-out tracks ahead, many of the passengers disembarked the trains and went into the town of East Conemaugh to pass the time. Some, however, chose to stay aboard these trains and wait. About a half-mile ahead was another train pulling 7 empty flat cars and a caboose, sitting idle as the crew assessed a rock slide. The engineer in charge of this train was John Hess, who lived right here in East Conemaugh with his wife and children. Railroad tracks were eroding into the water from the swollen river, and that's when it came, the terrible wall of destruction. It was heard a mile away as a low rumbling, growing louder and louder as it approached. Hess knew exactly what this was, and he opened up the throttle on his train. He also tied a rope around the whistle so that it let out one continuous warning cry as it was charging into the town. This caught the attention of the people of East Conemaugh, including the conductor of one of the express trains, who looked up to see the wall of water crashing around the corner dozens of feet high. He shouted for everyone to get off the train and make way for higher ground. There was a mad scramble as passengers trampled each other, leaping from the train car and down into the mud, where many of them got stuck. Several were swept away by the already flooded river. Some made it, others didn't even get off the train. Hess kept his train going with the whistle blasting until he passed the spot closest to his home, when he leapt from the locomotive and ran for his family, narrowly escaping the destruction that swept away his train. The express was thrown away like a toy with around 25 casualties on board. The roundhouse and every locomotive in the yard was swept through, and much of the town of East Conemaugh and the borough of Franklin across the river was destroyed. Now the valley became a straight, unobstructed path toward Johnstown, and it narrowed tightly, causing the wave to pick up speed and increase in height. It passed through one more town first, the small town of Woodvale, with a population of around 300. 1/3 of the residents were lost when nearly every building in town was washed away. A mill and a single span of bridge over the Pennsylvania Railroad were just about all that remained.
As it made its way to Johnstown, which you see right there at the end of the tracks, the valley narrows, and that means all that water has to be squeezed into that, creating a massive wall of water. As it neared Johnstown, some reports say that it was traveling at 40 miles an hour and was 60 feet tall.
Now all that remained between the wave and Johnstown itself was the Gautier Works of the Cambria Iron Company, a large factory and forge that stood on the spot where the Gautier Works mill is today. As the works were hit, smoke rose up, warning the people of Johnstown that something serious was happening in that direction. The wall of water took away the works and everyone and everything inside of it. The Gautier Works had just completed an order for miles and miles of barbed wire, and that order was waiting to be shipped out. When the water hit, it picked it up, and now that barbed wire snaked through every part of the wave as it crashed down onto Johnstown. Hetty Ogle, in the Western Union offices, sent out one final message on her telegraph. "This is my last message," she said. As the Gautier Works came down all together, church bells, factory whistles, and alarms rang out a warning, along with the cries from people already climbing the hills who were high enough to see the incoming wave over the buildings. They were able to warn at least some people in time to get out of the path of the flood. The wave smashed down onto Johnstown, branching off in 3 different directions as it broke around the terrain and large buildings. The Hulbert House was a large 4-story brick hotel on Clinton Street that was built shortly before the flood. Around 60 people had taken refuge inside of it from the previous flood waters, including Mrs. Smith and her daughters. Her husband had brought them there because he thought this was the safest structure nearby, and then he went back home to their small wooden house to weather the storm. As the wave hit, the Hulbert house collapsed to rubble, ending the lives of around 50 people, including Mrs. Smith and her family. Mr. Smith ironically survived at the home. As the wave hit, the Western Union office and Hetty Ogle's home, as well as the large library next door, were leveled. Hetty, her daughter, and the entire team were lost in the flood, having stayed by their posts until the very end. All that was found for sure of Hetty was her ring of keys, picked up by the debris field and now on display in the Johnstown Flood Museum. It's rumored that her body was found, but this isn't verified. After the wave swept across the city, home to 10,000 people, it slammed hard into the steep wall of Yoder Hill to the west. It crashed upwards before cresting back down on itself and moving out in all directions. The main force swept back across Johnstown, hitting the city with a second massive wave, while some of it went against the river and flooded the nearby boroughs upstream. The wave also crashed downstream to the north, but its path was blocked. As with the viaduct and the path down from South Fork, another stone railroad structure briefly arrested the path of the wave. This stone bridge across the Conemaugh River was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad only 1 year prior. It held against the wave, and debris clogged the archways beneath it. Now the terrible waters from the South Fork Dam were trapped for a time in Johnstown, sloshing back and forth across the town and pooling deeper and deeper as the floodwaters continued to pour up from the river. As the waters were rising earlier in the day, a common place of refuge within the city were the town's churches. Today, this is the Lincoln Center, at the location of the old Presbyterian church. The facade of the church is actually built into the center's atrium. Reverend David Beal was the pastor of the church, and right after the flood wave hit, he led his family and some of those sheltering in the church out onto the rooftops to the much taller Alma Hall, a few buildings down the road. When the large wave hit and the main force struck the town, it hit another church, the heavy stone Franklin Street Methodist Church, built 20 years earlier in 1869, which took the brunt of the wave and ended up splitting the water apart. As a result, buildings beyond it, like Alma Hall, were able to avoid a direct hit, and some remained standing. Now, Reverend David Beal, his family, and anywhere from 200 to 300 people were sheltering in the upper floors of Alma Hall. The first floor was submerged and the water rapidly rising into the second floor. The people in Alma Hall were a mixed bag, with some of them having been swept in on debris from as far away as East Conemaugh and climbing up into the building. Another gentleman, an attorney named James Walters, was swept from his home 4 blocks away and rode the wave off of its rebound off of Yoder Hill and was swept clean into a window on the 2nd floor of Alma Hall. Coincidentally, this was his own office that he rented for his practice. As the time passed, Reverend Beale led the hundreds of people in prayer. As he described it, quote, "This was indeed a solemn and impressive occasion. In this service were Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, Africans and Chinamen were united. It's doubtful that anyone in that entire building refused to pray with us that night," he said. Alma Hall would withstand the flooding and horrors soon to come, with reports of 2 babies having been born in there. 5 blocks away, directly in the path of where the water slammed the town, is St. John's Catholic Church. The previous day, it was hosting a funeral. Because of the storms, the body was still inside of the church. As the wave hit, a wooden house nearby where a woman was baking erupted into flames as the stove tipped over. As the wave rebounded through the same spot, that burning house was picked up in its entirety and slammed down onto the Catholic Church. The whole church went up into flames despite being soaking wet, and only the front face of the building remained after the flood. On the next street over was the school and convent associated with the church. As the waters rose, 9 nuns of the Sisters of Charity moved to the 2nd floor, to a small corner of the building where they had a chapel, and there they prayed. The building began to collapse around them, crumbling down into the raging flood waters, until at the very end, when the only portion of the building standing was the chapel. All 9 sisters, as well as 4 of their guests, survived uninjured. Today, the new St. John Cathedral was built on the location of the old convent and school, and the land where the previous church stood was sold off. The monstrance from St. John's was found and is on display. In a small garden at the intersection of Market and Main Street today in Johnstown is a life-size statue of a dog that once adorned the front yard of a mansion belonging to James Morley. The statue was carried off by the flood and found sometime later. This one is a replica, with the original in the Heritage Discovery Center in nearby Cambria. Nicknamed Morley, he's a fictional dog, but his story is often conflated with the story of Romney, a real Newfoundland dog that belonged to the Cress family in Johnstown. When the dam broke, the Cress family and their dog Romney climbed up onto the roof of their home, but Mrs. Cress, their daughter, and their maid all fell into the raging torrent of water. Romney leapt into the waves and actually managed to pull all 3 of them to safety. He himself survived as well. Romney became known as the hero dog of the Johnstown flood, and even though this statue has no direct connection to Romney, it still serves as a reminder of that dog's act of heroism. It's impossible to convey the full horrors of the great Johnstown disaster without detailing the hundreds and hundreds of stories of individuals to full families of 8 or 9 people who were crushed by falling buildings, trapped by flaming debris, or swept downriver, struggling in the current and disappearing under whirlpools. Some people were so close to rescue only to have it snatched away at the last moment. A Pennsylvania Railroad signal operator who was stationed downstream of Cambria and himself clear from any danger watched helplessly as a single large tree standing up from the raging river formed a terrifying eddy around it. He describes having seen countless men, women, children, and whole families swim for the tree for safety, only to get yanked under by the turbulent water and never resurface. Dr. Samuel Poland, a dentist in Johnstown, managed to hold on to his 2 young sons, Freddie and Walter, throughout the entire ordeal as he was forced to swim, only to realize at the end that he didn't hold them up high enough. Anna Fenn, husband of John Fenn, was the sole survivor of her family of 9 plus a maid. Anna was separated from her husband and struggled to rescue her family, losing them one by one. There were reports of Anna wandering distraught through the ruins for any traces of her family. There are many stories just like Anna's. Victor Heiser was a 16-year-old boy who was working for his parents' grocery store in Johnstown. As the waters were rising, he went across the street to move his family's horses to higher ground. The sirens went off, the church bells rang, and the rumbling of the wave was heard. He knew what was coming, and he turned around to see his parents in the house window waving for him to get to higher ground. He ran, and that was the last he ever saw of his parents. The barn he was in was washed away, and as it crumbled, he made his way through a trap door in the attic and out onto the roof. Jumping between different pieces of debris, he rode the wave for about 10 minutes before whatever he was on, as well as the entire remains of the city of Johnstown, had come to rest against the stone arch bridge belonging to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The town had been demolished, and the current moving downstream piled everything up against the bridge, the water slowly filtering out.
Despite the crushing weight of all of the water bearing down on it, as well as the weight of the city that had been carried away by the wave, the stone bridge managed to hold, slowing down the speed of the water and keeping that debris from heading into the next town and adding to the destruction there. It also meant that anyone who was holding on to debris from the city of Johnstown now had an opportunity, because they came to a stop here. They now had an opportunity to precariously climb through the field of debris that was piling up here and make it to solid ground, such as the hills here.
Still, others were trapped deep in the pile of wood and timber that now covered 30 acres. Some people ran as far as they could away from the piled up debris. Others ran out onto it to start freeing people. Evening was setting in as the debris by the stone bridge was scoured. Many people had been rescued from the rubble that the stone bridge held securely in place, saving it from being washed downstream, but hundreds more were calling for help, buried beneath the remains of 1,600 wooden structures all piled up. That's when it began. From deep within the debris, a smoldering fire ignited. Despite the wood no doubt being soaked, it spread, slow at first, then began to sweep across the massive field of lumber. It was a mad scramble to free as many people as they could, scrambling through the debris, following the screams as the valley filled with smoke and glowed red. One of the biggest difficulties in freeing the people in the debris was the shipment of barbed wire, which seems to have woven its way around everything, firmly tying the debris into a perfect pyre. One woman was pinned and trapped, and even though rescuers had cleared all of the debris off of her, they still couldn't get her out. As it turns out, her ankle, still buried, was being held firmly by a stranger who had lost his life hours prior. They did manage to loosen the grip, and they got her out just in time as the flames reached them. The ensuing fire burned for 3 days and 3 nights and claimed the lives of at least 80 more people who had previously survived the cataclysmic flood. The statistics published by the Johnstown Flood Museum, and often quoted, are that 99 families, some of which were quite large, were entirely wiped out. 396 children as well. All told, the most reliable accounting puts the final toll at 2,209 people who were lost throughout the Conemaugh Valley.
However, one of those people shouldn't have been counted. Leroy Temple was a resident of Johnstown, and he had been carried, along with half of the city, down the river and up against the stone bridge here. He managed to climb out, up onto the bridge, onto that embankment, actually, specifically the north side embankments, and then he just left. He went all the way back to where he was from, in Beverly, Massachusetts. He lived there for over 10 years before coming back to Johnstown to see how the town had done, to see how things had been rebuilt, and to visit his old friends, who were shocked to see that he was actually alive after all. Leroy Temple got up and walked away without telling anybody, and didn't come back for over 10 years.
It would take a long time before any accurate counts of the losses would come in, however. Now the locals faced the grisly task of cleaning up the destruction. The fire did little to clear up the debris, which was still piled 70 feet deep in some areas. Bodies were hastily picked up due to fear of the outbreak of disease, but they were still handled with respect. There were so many tragic stories that came to light as they dug for the bodies. I don't want to go into many of them, but one particular poignant one was the story of a piece of paper. It was a shopping list for cake ingredients written by a mother and wrapped around a coin given to her daughter, who was sent out to the store to fetch those groceries. Her body was found still clutching the coin and paper. In Pittsburgh, nearly 80 miles downstream, a cradle was snatched up from the river, and inside was a 5-month-old baby, still alive and well. This house was perhaps one of the most photographed buildings in the aftermath of the flood. This house belonged to John Schultz and his family of 9. When the wave hit, it was impaled by this massive tree. The house was lifted off of its foundations with 6 people inside of it, and the house was carried down to the far end of the street. Everyone inside survived. Most telegraph lines had been obliterated in and around Johnstown, so getting the word out was nearly impossible. Although early warnings gave places like Pittsburgh an idea that something bad was about to happen to Johnstown, it wasn't until debris and bodies began floating past the city on the Allegheny River that they knew what had happened. Some bodies were washing up as far away as Cincinnati, Ohio. As the bodies were picked up, temporary morgues were established all over the city, with detailed records being kept of the bodies brought into each. This book on display at the Johnstown Flood Museum details the casualties processed at Morgue C, which was established in the Pennsylvania Railroad Depot and processed 511 bodies. In the aftermath of the flood, there was anarchy in the city. There were reports of armed gangs and looters, with the Johnstown police force entirely overwhelmed by the situation. They ended up deputizing virtually any man willing to wear a temporary badge cut from tin, with many of them abusing their power. There are stories of looters and robbers being hanged in the streets. As a result, the governor sent in the 14th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment under General Hastings to set up camp in Central Park and enforce law and order over the city as relief was sent in, as well as to provide a labor force of 600 able-bodied men. Johnstown was in desperate need of aid, and in the following days, trains full of food and supplies and volunteers from all over Pennsylvania came flooding in. But so did reporters. At times, the reporters seemed to be a nuisance, but they had one special benefit. They raised awareness around the world and brought in financial assistance from every corner of the globe. Some sources say that in the very first week of fundraising, the city of Philadelphia alone raised over $1 million, or around $34 million today. New York City gave $600,000. It's said that every state in the Union and every country in Europe gave something, from backcountry churches to small boys' orphanages. A wave of charities swept over the world. The Shah of Persia sent $50, the Sultan of Turkey sent $8,000, the London Stock Exchange $5,000, John Jacob Astor in New York sent $2,500, and Thomas Edison in New Jersey sent $200. The Willard Asylum for the Insane in New York took up a collection among staff and patients and sent $136. Special benefit performances were conducted by celebrities of the time, such as John Philip Sousa, Buffalo Bill Cody, and even the brother of John Wilkes Booth. In Atlantic City, New Jersey, a dramatic recreation of the flood was performed. A promotional poster for the show is on display in the Flood Museum. Special souvenir spoons like this one were sold. Now, was this made as a keepsake of the flood, or is this an actual artifact that somebody decided that they were going to engrave with the word Johnstown Flood? I don't know. Over $27,000 was raised by members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. In their defense, many of these members were completely unaware of the horrible maintenance that their club was performing on the dam, and yet some of these members were among the more charitable donors towards the relief efforts. To manage these funds, which totaled around $3 million in 1889, or around $100 million today, the Johnstown Flood Relief Commission was established by the governor of Pennsylvania. They worked to rebuild the city through the end of the year, dispersing large relief checks to the victims and their families. And at the end of the year, the remaining funds were used to build 2 large hospitals and then set up a trust for the Johnstown orphans. In 1889, the American Red Cross was in its infancy. Up until then, the organization had been caring for refugees and responding to smaller disasters, but the Johnstown flood would be one of the first major efforts that the American Red Cross would respond to, and it helped put them on the map. Under the command of Clara Barton, the American Red Cross set out from Washington, D.C., which at the time was also flooded, and reached Johnstown about a week after the disaster. The Red Cross set up shelters throughout the city in the form of large structures that they called hotels, featuring lodging, dining, bathing, and other day-to-day facilities.
Initially, the efforts of Clara and the Red Cross were headquartered out of a tent located on Prospect Hill behind the camera. However, as order began to reign once again in Johnstown, she moved her headquarters to this house, one of only a few still standing today in Johnstown that predate the flood. When the flood happened, the water came pouring in from the valley over in this direction and essentially moved that way behind the camera. We're up on a bit of a hill right now, so many of the buildings and houses in this immediate area were relatively undamaged, including this house. Today, the house is owned by the Johnstown Area Heritage Association and is currently undergoing renovations.
The Red Cross distributed blankets like these to anyone in the city who needed them. The Red Cross was in Johnstown for a full 5 months, dispersing some of the greatest relief that the city would receive, and Johnstown remained grateful for it. A year later, when a tornado struck Kentucky, or a year after that when famine struck Russia, the American Red Cross was there to provide relief. And who was one of their greatest donors? The City of Johnstown. They were still not yet back on their feet, and yet they were quick to show their endearing love and gratitude towards the benevolence of Miss Barton. Many of the bodies from the disaster were buried in temporary graves until a more permanent location could be figured out for them. Hundreds of them were buried in the hills around the town, many of which were lost track of and still remain buried in those hills 135 years later. While nearly every old cemetery in the Conemaugh Valley contains at least some victims, the largest share of them were reburied in the Grandview Cemetery at the top of Yoder Hill, the same cemetery that Daniel Morrell was buried in, passing away in the midst of his protest against the South Fork Hunting and Fishing Club's negligence. The mass grave in Grandview contains nearly 800 unidentified bodies, lined in neat rows as if a military grave. On a clear day, the graves look out onto the sunset. A monument was erected at the head of the grave in 1892 and dedicated by the state of Pennsylvania. It's said that 10,000 people attended its unveiling. A walk through the cemetery reveals that even beyond the mass grave, there are countless headstones that list off the date of May 31st, 1889. Other flood victims that were identified and buried in family plots. One that I came upon is the plot of the Curlin family. So of these 8 bodies here in this plot, 3 died prior to the flood. 2 children and what I assume is his first wife. 4 of the 8 died in the flood, May 31st, 1889. Including his second wife and 3 of his children. Finally, 10 days after the flood, June 10th, Thomas Curlin died as well. Was he hurt? Physically? Died of his wounds? Or was he too distraught? Despite the fires that raged for days, much of the wooden debris was still in the city, blocking up roadways and clogging the river at the Stone Arch Bridge. To begin clearing up this massive field of wreckage in the river, the Arthur Kirk and Son Company was brought in to begin using explosives to shake loose the debris, but they were a bit heavy-handed and ended up causing additional unnecessary damage to the city. They were fired. The Army ended up bringing in engineers who continued to use explosives and controlled burns to clear out the debris. Well, this got out of hand, and they were relieved of duty. Arthur Kirk was then brought back in to finish the job. Slowly, the shops reopened. School was back in session in time for the new school year in September, and life returned to some version of normal. The Cambria Iron Company was back in business quickly after the disaster, knowing the urgency to give families a stable income once more. It prospered into the 19th century and even contributed steel to various famous landmarks. Let me tangent from the story of Johnstown for just a moment. Many of my viewers will recognize the ship I'm on right now. I'm on the Milwaukee Clipper in Muskegon, Michigan. I did a full documentary on this ship, but I was just back here visiting, and we made a pretty cool discovery. Most of the steel in this ship, not all, but most of the steel is stamped Cambria, meaning the steel in the Milwaukee Clipper, originally the Juniata, was forged in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Now it was time for Johnstown to look towards its future. The city was slow to rebuild. We can compare maps of the city from before the flood to ones drawn 2 years after it, and still, much of the town consists of empty lots. To help with the homeless crisis, many prefabricated homes were brought in from around the country to be put up in the city. Although there were many companies that sold them, they all took on the nickname of Oklahoma houses. There's only one known survivor of this house design, and it is on display as part of the Johnstown Flood Museum, where visitors can enter the building and see what these houses were like. Given the city's predisposition to flooding, a new community was built on top of Yoder Hill in the 1890s. Many of these residents were workers of the ironworks, so the Cambria Iron Company built an inclined plane up Yoder Hill to aid in their commute. That inclined plane still stands today, connecting the community at the top with Johnstown at the bottom, the plane having been built as a direct result of the flood. The South Fork Dam was never rebuilt, and today is a national memorial, part of the National Park System. Was the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which was responsible for the dam, to blame for the flood? Well, it's certainly easy to blame them for the horrible maintenance and foolish modifications to the structure. They were negligent and reckless. But interestingly, an engineering report published after the disaster, and an additional one 100 years later removing any possible bias, reported that the South Fork Dam would have failed during that storm, even if all safety measures were in place and the dam had been properly maintained. They were selfish fools, but the storm had dropped so much rainwater on the area that the dam was going to overflow regardless. Nonetheless, public sentiment was completely against the club, and understandably so. The club was ultimately dissolved, and Elias Unger moved to Petoskey, Michigan, getting far away from Pennsylvania. The club houses were vacated, and then used to shelter families who had lost their homes in the flood. This wasn't the end of flooding in Johnstown, though, although nothing would ever top the destruction of 1889. In 1936, heavy rainfall flooded the city once more under 17 feet of water and cost the lives of 25 people. At that point, the federal government stepped in and basically said, all right, you guys got to get it together, and they passed the Flood Control Act of 1936. The river was turned from a naturally flowing riverbank to a reinforced channel, and the government boasted that Johnstown was now flood-free. They continued to boast that until around 1977, when the city flooded again. In that 1977 flood, not only did the city flood from heavy rain, but 6 different dams near Johnstown failed, flooding the Conemaugh Valley all over again. Still, the floodwater was less than that of the 1889 disaster, despite the loss of 84 people. Johnstown today is a thriving city, although the many floods throughout its history still shape and define the city's character. The Johnstown Flood Museum tells the story of the disaster in a tasteful and respectable manner, and is full of images and artifacts, including many seen in this video, and countless others. Remnants of the flood are still being discovered. Outside the museum, you'll find a pair of wheels from a Pennsylvania Railroad train car from the 1880s, unearthed in 2011. In nearby Cambria City is the Johnstown Heritage Discovery Center, a great additional museum space, and a wonderful place for kids to play, where my wife and son spent most of their time while I was off filming this documentary. Between Johnstown and the South Fork Dam Park is a hiking trail known as the Path of the Flood Trail, where hikers can follow the route that the terrible wall of water traveled, seeing every significant site along the way. I followed the trail myself, but deviated a bit through the woods in order to see the sites of the viaduct that burst. A new one has been built in its place with 2 arches this time, and is still in use by the railroad today. The originally built viaduct was completed in 1834 and was 78 feet tall. Originally built with 1 arch, it was a popular picnic spot for people from Johnstown and nearby areas. While over a dozen books were sourced for this documentary, including a handful of antique books published shortly after the disaster, an excellent one that I referred to was The 1889 Flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania by Dr. Michael McGuff. Thank you as well to Bill Hunsberger for letting me film on the property of his bed and breakfast, where the original grave of Johnstown's founder is located. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and share the video around. Be sure to also visit my Patreon at the link below, or consider signing up for my YouTube channel memberships. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankerts, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Mulikar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Fraser, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarkey, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Moles, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, High Treason, The Peppermilk, Tristan White, Jason Stray, Chance Hudson, Robert Mayer III, Jordan Page, The Handler, Georgia Tsifa, Drew Shelton, Craven Moorhead, and Jennifer and Sarah Vaughn.